Welcome back to our very last section of people and ideas on the move. Today we're going to talk about the very first monotheistic faith, which is Judaism, and how it emerged in this same region that we have been looking at really carefully, which is the area where the Phoenicians were. So we left off with the Phoenicians, and some of the images that are in front of you should remind you a little bit about that. So the Phoenicians were a great seafaring people, and they used sails on their vessels, but they also man-powered their vessels, which allowed them to travel about 30 miles per day. So we talked about how even though they were extremely skilled, there was limited movement by the day. And some of the lasting legacies of the Phoenician people was the export of papyrus paper out of Byblos. We talked about how the Bible had gotten its name from one of the Phoenician city-states. The murex, which allowed for the reddish-purple dye to be exported out of Sidon and Tyre, and how that became a really important symbolism around royalty because the dye was so expensive. And then probably most importantly, that the Phoenician trade language, their simplified phonetic alphabet, became the foundation for Greek, which became the foundation for the English language. We talked about all of that last week. And today we are going to talk about Roman numeral 4, section 4 of your notes. So you should be in your notebooks taking notes. And our very last section is the origins of Judaism. And here on this screen, while you're writing the origins of Judaism, you can see some of the kind of symbolism behind Judaism. Down here you have a menorah. You guys are probably familiar with this image of a menorah. This symbolically represents Judaism, the symbol here. Today we're going to talk about Abraham, who is the father of multiple faiths according to sacred text, and Judaism and Islam and Christianity can all trace their roots back to Abraham. Jesus is in the sacred text of all three of these world religions, and so Judaism is kind of the foundation, and Christianity will stem off of Judaism, and Islam will be kind of forming alongside of Judaism. So all very, very connected with lots of commonalities. Down here you have a few of the kind of vocab words. We're going to talk about the Hebrew people today, and you're going to learn about or be reminded about Exodus, which is part of the Old Testament according to the Christian faith and is part of the Talmud or the Torah according to the Jewish faith. Kosher is a style of eating. There's a part of the Bible that says, or part of the Torah and the Old Testament that talks about not mixing the milk and the meat. And Jews choose to interpret that in a way that has led to a kosher way of eating, which means you don't mix meat and dairy products together at the same time in a meal. So there's a very specific way of eating in the conservative Judaic tradition. Jews have rabbis. Bar mitzvah is the kind of coming of age ceremony, as a bat mitzvah is for girls and a bar mitzvah is for boys. And that's a kind of a coming of age ceremony in Judaism. It happens around, I think, 13 or 14 years old, right around that. Okay, and away we go. So when we left off, we were talking about Phoenician trade, and we had talked about Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, and how this area was called Phoenicia. But they had controlled large parts of the Mediterranean Ocean, and that they had traveled, perhaps, according to Herodotus, as far north as the British Isles and as far south, maybe, as around the entire continent of Africa. Zooming in on that area of Phoenicia, you can see that this area was also populated in this section by a number of other groups of people. So just to give you kind of a heads up, we're going to talk about Judah. The Philistines will be mentioned today. Jerusalem will be mentioned today. The Kingdom of Israel. And you can see those old city-states right here that we've already been talking about. Okay. Away we go. The Phoenicians lived in a region at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea that was later called Palestine, but the Phoenicians were not the only ancient people to live there. The Romans had given the area that name after the Philistines, another group of people who had lived in the region. There we go. And Canaan, which was this kind of whole area, was the ancient home of the Hebrews, later called the Jews. The Jews get their name from this, one of their strongest tribes, this part of the kingdom. Their history, their legend, their moral laws are a major influence on Western culture, and they began a tradition that is also shared by Christians and Muslims as well. So ancient Palestine's location made it a cultural crossroads of the ancient world. By land, it connected Asia, Africa, and two great empires, both eager to expand. To the east lay the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and to the west, the Egyptians. Palestine's seaports opened onto two most important waterways of the time, the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. Most of what we know about the early history of the Hebrew people comes to us from sacred text. So again, we've looked at Hinduism, we've looked at Buddhism, and what their sacred text has to say about their religion. So most of today comes, I'm warning you, from sacred text. So most of what we know about the early history of the Hebrews is contained in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The Jews call these books the Torah and consider them the most sacred writings in their tradition. Christians respect them as part of the Old Testament. One of the reasons that we would look at sacred text and the stories around the kind of legends or the versions of history that they tell is that there are lots of references throughout literary works that contain kind of this expectation that you would understand these stories, and not knowing them, I think, makes it difficult to analyze literature later on. In addition, this is the version of history that many people around the world choose to believe about, and anyway, just keep in mind, it is sacred text. Depending upon who you are, you might give that a lot of historical credit, and some people would give it very little historical credit. But just like the legend of the Minotaur, sometimes when you look at things that seem like they have stories that are far-fetched or difficult to believe, there are shreds of truth within them. And so what we're looking for are the shreds of truth. So most of what we know comes from the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible called the Torah. And the Jews consider them very sacred, and Christians respect them as part of the Old Testament. And in the Torah, God chose Abraham to become the father of the Hebrew people. God's words to Abraham, which are, again, part of sacred text, expressed a promise of land and a pledge. According to Genesis, it says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great." And so, according to sacred text, Abraham left with a group of people and moved his people and searched and searched and searched. And finally came upon Canaan, the land that they believed God had promised to them, the land of milk and honey, it's also called, according to sacred text. So Abraham moves his family to Canaan, and over the course of, I think about 150, 250 years after that, those same people migrate to Egypt. Okay. So Abraham moves his family to Canaan. Well, he actually starts the process of the move. He doesn't get there. And then from Canaan, the descendants go down to Egypt. And in part, it's probably because the land that they came across, Canaan, is a really brutal place. I mean, geographically speaking, there aren't a lot of resources there. People continue to this day to fight over basics like water and, territory. Abraham was a shepherd who lived in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia, and the book of Genesis tells that God commanded him to move his people to Canaan. So around 1800 BCE, Abraham and his family and their herds and their followers made their way to Canaan. But around 1650 BCE, the descendants of Abraham moved to Egypt. The God of Abraham, the Bible tells about how Abraham and his family roamed for many years from Mesopotamia, headed to Canaan, and then from Canaan to Egypt, and then back to Canaan again. All the while, their God, whose name was Yahweh, supposedly was watching over them. Gods worshipped by other people were often local and associated with a specific place. But unlike the other groups around them who were polytheistic, the Hebrews were monotheistic. They prayed to only one God. Monotheism, or a belief in a single God, comes from the Greek words meaning mono, meaning one, and theism, meaning God worship. The Hebrews proclaimed Yahweh as the one and only God, and in their eyes, God was not a physical being, and no physical images were to be made of him. And this is where Judaism and Islam have something in common. The faiths do not represent through illustration, images of God. And in fact, I was just listening to a story today reminding us of the historical event that there was a lot of conflict around a cartoon that surfaced representing Allah in a form. And so that led to some protests around the world. And most recently, when a teacher was teaching about that, led to a horrible event where the teacher was attacked and actually killed. Abraham had promised to obey Yahweh, and in return, Yahweh had promised to protect Abraham and all of his descendants. And the mutual promise between God and the founder of the Hebrew people is called a covenant. So this is the first covenant with God, when God is kind of like a contract, although I don't know that they would agree with that explanation. But it's a two-way deal, right? That you do what God asks you to do, and in return, God is going to protect you and provide for you as a people. Okay, now the next part of the story. So here's Abraham starting off, wandering. Probably, if we're thinking about lifespans, probably not actually making it to Canaan, but his people. He starts the wandering process, and his people and descendants make it to Canaan. Damascus is in contemporary Syria. And then around 1650 BC, so about 150 years after this initial takeoff, then they move down into Egypt, maybe pushed out by the people that were already there or by the lack of resources that they found in Canaan. So there they go. Okay. So according to Genesis, let me pull this story up really quick. Okay, so according to a story in Genesis, Abraham is tested by God. His loyalty is tested when he is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. And Abraham proves his loyalty to God by taking Isaac to a specific place, bounding him up and preparing to actually sacrifice his first son to God. And then just as he's about to do it, an angel interferes and tells him to stop, and then provides supposedly a ram that was caught in a thicket nearby. And so Abraham then goes to get the ram and sacrifices that instead. And so this supposedly was demonstrating God testing Abraham's faith and his loyalty to God, and then showing mercy by providing him with an animal to sacrifice instead. Okay, so now we are like 1650 BCE, and we are into a another important aspect of the Judaic tradition, which is Moses and the Exodus. So the stories that you're going to hear here are from Exodus largely, which is another part of the Torah or Old Testament. So the Bible says the Hebrews migrated to Egypt because of a drought and the threat of famine. And at first, the Hebrews were given places of honor in the Egyptian kingdom. What I've read historically is that this group of people settled kind of outside on the outside edges of the Egyptian kingdom. But then as the Egyptian kingdom grew and wanted to kind of dominate the region, the Hebrew people that had settled on the outside edges and had kind of been left alone for a period of time, now the Egyptians kind of moved in and decided they were going to try to kind of provide some structure and rules to the Hebrew people. And the Hebrew people had gotten used to being left to themselves and didn't like these rules being put upon them. So they become oppressed, and they become in some sacred text, it'll say they become enslaved by the Egyptians. Now, what we know historically about the Egyptians is that the Egyptians expected people within the empire to provide a certain amount of service to the empire on the regular. So on a regular basis. Some sources suggest like maybe 1 month out of 3 that the Egyptian people were providing to the empire to do things like construct canals, construct pyramids, for example. And so it's possible that the Hebrew people were being asked to do the same kind of work tribute as everybody else in Egypt. But they resist. So either through that, or maybe they were enslaved, as sacred text suggests, but the Hebrew people decide that they want to be out of these forced responsibilities. So they decide that they're going to flee. So from 1300 to 1200 BCE, Jews call this event the Exodus, and they remember it every year during Passover. But what they do is demand to be set free. So the Torah says that the man who led the Hebrews out of slavery was a man named Moses. It is told that at the time of Moses' birth, the Egyptian Pharaoh felt threatened by the number of Hebrews in Egypt and thus ordered the Hebrew male babies to be killed. Moses' mother had hid her baby in the reeds along the banks of the Nile River, and an Egyptian princess had found and adopted him. And though raised in luxury, he did not forget his Hebrew birth. And when God commanded him to lead the Jews out of Egypt, he rose up and obeyed. So this is the story told in the Prince of Egypt. When Moses rises up and supposedly tells the Pharaoh at the time and his own family, his kin, that he must release the Hebrew people, the Egyptian Pharaoh refuses, according to sacred text. And what happens next is the 10 plagues of Egypt. So let's take a look at that. Sorry, turning off the background so you can hear better.
Once I called you brother, once I thought the chance to make you laugh was all I ever wanted. And even now, I wish that God had chose another. Serving as your foe on his behalf is the last thing that I wanted. This was my home. All this pain and devastation, how it tortures me inside. All the innocent who suffer from your stubbornness and pride. Who I called brother, why must to call down another blow. Let my people go. Thus saith the Lord. You who I call brother, how could you have come to hate me so? Is this what you wanted? Then let my heart be hardened, and never mind how high the toss may grow. This will still be so. I will never let your people go. Thus saith the Lord. I will not let my people go.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to...
Okay, hang on, don't write for just a moment. I just want to show you that. I'll show you right after this. So the second covenant with God comes from this relationship that develops between Moses and God, and a new covenant emerges as Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and on his return back toward Canaan receives the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments become the basis of Hebrew law, the basis of Judaism, and the Old Testament as part of the Christian faith, that becomes part, like the basic tenets of Christianity as well. So the Ten Commandments get revealed to Moses. He comes down supposedly from the top of a mountain and has these 2 stone tablets in his arms, and upon them have been inscribed the Ten Commandments. Here are the plagues of Egypt in order. So supposedly what happens according to Exodus is that all of these happen in turn, gradually kind of wearing the Egyptians down. But the Pharaoh refuses to allow the Hebrews to go until the last one, the death of the firstborn, which ends up taking even the Pharaoh's own son. And when the Pharaoh loses his own son, he's just broken, supposedly, and releases the Hebrews. And then Moses flees with them back toward Canaan again. So I wonder if, as you're watching the Prince of Egypt video, if you'll be able to kind of identify them covering each of these. Okay. The Ten Commandments get kept in something called the Ark of the Covenant, and that's going to be where we end our story today. So keep going. So here's that journey. Abraham leaving Ur, 150 years later, the Hebrew people getting to Canaan, them leaving due to drought in like conditions, heading into Egypt, getting oppressed there, and returning. This is the Exodus out of Egypt and back toward Canaan again. And that's where we're at. A couple of things just to know about the Judaic tradition. There's a lot to know. But the Torah, the most sacred text, is kept on a scroll. And in the Judaic tradition, this is the way that sacred text is kept, on a scroll. So we've looked at lots of different ways. Remember the Jatakas were kind of on long, narrow index cards. And anyway, the Torah is on a scroll. This is like an important centerpiece in a Judaic house of worship. And so later on, like during World War II, for example, when they talk about people storming synagogues and taking the scrolls and ripping them apart in the streets, it's really highly offensive to the Judaic peoples to have their valuable scrolls ruined. Okay, last piece for today. So Canaan, The land that the Hebrews believed that had been promised to them by God combined really harsh features. There was arid desert, rocky wilderness, grassy hills, really hot, dry valley near the Jordan River. Water was not plentiful, and even numerous limestone formations soaked up the excess rainfall that did fall. So after first settling in the south central area of ancient Palestine, the Hebrews began to expand both south and north in search of an easier way of surviving. Now, the problem is that there were already people to the south and north of that area, and so they're going to run into conflict. So originally, the Hebrew people were divided into 12 tribes, and one of the largest tribes, and each of those tribes had judges. And during times of great conflict, supposedly, they would rise kind of a judge up to help kind of organize all the tribes and to make decisions for the Hebrew people. So the judges occasionally pulled together the widely scattered tribes for a united military effort. But the people to the south, the Philistines, threatened Hebrews' position in ancient Palestine. The Hebrews got along a little bit better with their Canaanite neighbors, but eventually the only large tribe of the 12 tribes left was a tribe called Judah. And as a result, the Hebrews came to be called the Jews and their religion called Judaism. So the Hebrews are feeling threatened by the Philistines and the Canaanites, and they're going to come together to try to kind of establish themselves in this area. So from about 1020 to 922 BCE, the Hebrews united under 3 able kings. And today we're going to talk about Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul, David, and Solomon. Okay. For about 100 years, Israel had united all of its tribes together and enjoyed its greatest period of power and independence. So we're going to talk about the 3 kings and what each of them provided to the Hebrew people. So Saul was the first of the 3 able kings, and he was chosen largely because of his success in being able to finally drive the Philistines out of the central hills that was part of the ancient Palestinian area. So Saul is portrayed by the Bible as a pretty tragic man, that he was given to bouts of jealousy. After his death, he was succeeded by his son-in-law, David. So back to Saul, though, because on the matching activity, if you see Saul, he is responsible for kind of driving the Philistines out and establishing a territory, a larger territory for the early kingdom of Israel. King David was far more popular than Saul, and he does something extremely important that continues to be an important aspect of the Judaic tradition today, which is to create Jerusalem as the capital. He also further united the tribes and founded the beginnings of a dynasty. So far more popular, able to kind of unite what was left of the tribes of the Hebrews, create a capital city of Jerusalem, and grow the kingdom. We'll end with a map that shows the growth between Saul and David. So under David, the kingdom grows substantially. Finally, under Solomon, about 962 BCE, David is succeeded by his own son, Solomon, whose mother is Bathsheba. Solomon was the most powerful of the Hebrew kings. He built a trading empire with the help of his friend Hiram, the king of the Phoenician city of Tyre. That should all sound familiar. The crowning achievement of his extensive building program in Jerusalem was a great temple. So he built a temple in Jerusalem that continues to be one of the most sacred spots for Jews today, called the Temple of Solomon. He built it to glorify God, and the temple was also supposed to be the permanent home of the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant is the object which holds the tablets that were revealed to Moses. So the second covenant with God. The temple that Solomon built was not large, but it was beautiful. It gleamed like a precious gem. It had bronze pillars that stood at the temple's entrance. The temple on the outside was stone, while its inner walls were made of cedar and covered in gold. The main hall was super richly decorated with brass and gold, and Solomon also built a royal palace that was even more costly and more magnificent than the temple itself. So the Temple of Solomon eventually got destroyed by the Romans, but what's left behind of that temple is called the Wailing Wall. Now today, Jews go to what's left of this temple that had been built by King Solomon that houses the Ark of the Covenant, which had the tablet of Moses and the Moses tablets inside. All of that, there's one wall left, and it's the most sacred spot. So when you see a big white brick wall, I'm going to show you really quickly. You just need to see it. And Jews will go there to worship today. Let's see. I'm just going to bring this whole thing over and do a new share really quickly. No, I don't need to do a new share. Anyway, this is what's left of the Temple of Solomon. Just this wall. And it's called the Wailing Wall because Jews from around the world will go there, put little prayers inside, and then stand and kind of rock and pray in front of it. So this is likely the Torah. And this is a Hasidic Jew because he interprets, there are groups of Jews that interpret sacred text in different ways. And some of the most conservatives say that they see a place in sacred text that says they should not cut this particular lock of hair. And so they're called Hasidic Jews usually, I think, or Orthodox Jews, but they don't cut this lock. So they have this long lock of hair right around their earlobe. Okay, so King Solomon builds this great temple to house the Ark of the Covenant, and we are going to see the Ark of the Covenant according to the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay, just to give you a sense of what it looks like according to sacred text. Now, suppose the Ark has all kinds of power, and people who were non-believers that touched it with their hands would be kind of shocked. Some sacred texts believe that like lightning bolts would shoot out and strike down non-believers. So inside this is where the Ten Commandments are held.
All right, take it up. Easy. You're as stubborn as that girl.
You like her too much, I think.
Your methods of archaeology are too primitive for me. You would use a bulldozer to find China. Come. Get it! We're coming!
Okay, so last piece for today. So here's Saul's kingdom. David establishes the capital city of Jerusalem and expands the empire to include these space. Remember, he was the most popular. And then Solomon comes along and expands it even further. And see that this is laid right over top of where we just left behind the Phoenician people, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Okay. And last piece for today. Supposedly King Solomon was a very, very wise man. And this is the last story that I'll tell you from this ancient sacred text. But according to sacred text, Solomon was so wise, and he demonstrated his wisdom through this story. So 2 women came to him and said, "This baby, it is ours." They both claimed that the baby was theirs. And they came to him and made their case in front of him and said, "Please grant me this baby, it is mine." And the other lady, of course, "This is my baby, grant it to me." So Solomon, being wise, said, "My decision is to split the baby into 2. Split the baby into 2 and then give half to each woman, and the problem will be solved." One woman was fine with that decision, and another woman was not, and said, No, please don't split the baby into 2. And the baby will be killed." And then Solomon stopped right there and said, "The true mother would care about the welfare of the baby more than whether she possessed it or not, and thus she is the true mother," and then granted the baby not divided up to the real mother, according to Solomon. There you go. Okay. You guys will need to be doing some studying because we have a test on Wednesday. So heads up, get to your reviews and look carefully at what we've covered here. There's a more detailed version online if you prefer it, but this is, I think, what you'll need to know. Okay? Thank you very much. Provide feedback if you feel like you need to.